Imagine a city recovering from a devastating war where trust is a scarce commodity and paranoia rules the narrow streets. The year is 399 BC, and Athens is licking its wounds after the long and brutal Peloponnesian War against Sparta. In this atmosphere of fear and resentment, a 70-year-old man walks barefoot through the marketplace, known as the Agora, not to buy goods, but to question souls. This is not a common criminal, but a man whose weapon is his tongue, and whose crime is thinking differently. The state is about to put philosophy itself on trial, in a case that will echo through millennia as the ultimate miscarriage of justice. This is the story of the first martyr of free speech. The setting is ancient Athens, which is often hailed as the cradle of democracy and the beacon of Western civilization. However, the Athens of 399 BC was a shadow of its former glory, having been crushed by Sparta and briefly ruled by a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. These puppet rulers had executed hundreds of citizens and seized property, leaving deep scars on the psyche of the population. Although democracy had been restored, the people were looking for scapegoats to blame for their loss of empire and divine favor. The mood was volatile and dangerous for anyone who dared to stand out or question the traditional ways of the city-state. Enter Socrates, who was a figure as controversial, as he was recognizable with his snub nose and bulging eyes and unkempt beard. Unlike the sophists who charged high fees to teach wealthy young men how to argue their way out of trouble, Socrates charged nothing and claimed to know nothing. He spent his days wandering the gymnasium and the agora, engaging anyone who would listen in relentless questioning. He stripped away their pretensions of wisdom and exposed their ignorance in public. While the youth found this dismantling of authority figures hilarious, the powerful men of Athens found it deeply humiliating and dangerous to the social order. The tension finally snapped when 3 accusers stepped forward to draft a formal indictment against the philosopher. The lead accuser was Meletus, who was a young and ambitious poet with a hooked nose and wispy beard, representing the offended creative class. He was backed by Lycon, representing the orators, and most importantly by Anytus. Anytus was a wealthy tanner and a powerful politician who represented the craftsmen and politicians who had been stung by the sharp wit of Socrates. Together, they filed a writ at the royal stoa charging Socrates with 2 capital crimes that carried the penalty of death. The specific charges written on the tablet were impiety and corruption of the youth. Specifically, the indictment read that Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state and of introducing other new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. These were not merely religious accusations, but political ones in disguise. By accusing him of rejecting state gods, they were labeling him subversive. By accusing him of corrupting the youth, they were blaming him for the actions of his former students like Alcibiades and Critias, who had betrayed Athens and led the bloody tyranny. The legal system of Athens was unlike any modern court, as there were no lawyers and no judges to interpret the law. The trial took place before a massive jury of 500 and 1 male citizens chosen by lot from the population. The trial was a spectator sport and a form of public theater where the prosecutor and the defendant had to speak for themselves. A water clock known as a clepsydra timed their speeches, ensuring that neither side spoke longer than the other. It was a battle of persuasion where emotional appeal often outweighed factual evidence or logical deduction. On the day of the trial, the atmosphere was electric, with the murmurs of the crowd packing the benches. Meletus took the stand first and delivered a speech that painted Socrates as a dangerous atheist and a sophist who made the worse argument appear the stronger. He argued that Socrates was a spiritual poison that had infected the minds of the young men of Athens, turning them against their fathers and their traditions. The prosecution played on the fears of the jury, reminding them of the recent civil strife, and suggesting that tolerating such a man would bring down the wrath of the gods once more. When it was his turn to speak, Socrates did not beg for mercy or parade his weeping wife and children before the jury as was the custom. Instead, he stood defiant and employed the very method of questioning that had landed him in trouble in the first place. He cross-examined Meletus and made him look foolish by trapping him in contradictions. Socrates argued that he was not a teacher, but a gadfly sent by the god Apollo to sting the lazy horse of Athens into wakefulness. He claimed his mission was a divine mandate, and that he was the greatest benefactor the city had ever known. This defense, which is known to history as the apology, was not an apology in the modern sense of saying sorry, but a defense justification. However, his tone was perceived by many in the jury as arrogant and condescending. He told them that he would not stop philosophizing even if they acquitted him, because he obeyed God rather than men. He explained that his friend Chaerephon had asked the oracle at Delphi if anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle said no one was wiser. Socrates claimed he only questioned people to prove the oracle wrong, but found that he was indeed wiser only because he knew that he knew nothing. The investigation of the jury into his character was happening in real time as they watched him dismantle his accusers. Yet the underlying current of the trial was not about logic, but about conformity. The jury was composed of ordinary citizens, consisting of farmers and shopkeepers and veterans, who valued tradition and social cohesion above abstract truth. To them, Socrates sounded like an elitist who looked down on their democratic values. His association with the hated 30 tyrants, even if he had disobeyed their illegal orders, hung over the proceedings like a dark cloud that no amount of logic could disperse. When the arguments concluded, the herald called for the vote, and the jurors cast their bronze ballots into one of two urns. The result was closer than the prosecutors had expected, but the verdict was clear. By a margin of roughly 280 to 221, the jury found Socrates guilty. The surprise was not the conviction, but the narrowness of the margin. If only 30 people had voted differently, the father of Western philosophy would have walked free. Now the trial moved to the second phase, which was the determination of the penalty. In Athenian law, the prosecutor proposed a penalty, and the defendant proposed a counter penalty, and the jury had to choose one of the two. Meletus demanded the death penalty. It was expected that Socrates would propose a heavy fine or exile, which the jury would likely accept to avoid the stain of executing an old man. Exile was the standard solution for political dissidents, and it would have solved the problem for Anytus and Meletus by removing the gadfly from the city without bloodshed. However, Socrates refused to play the game, and instead he doubled down on his defiance. He argued that since he was a benefactor to the city, who had neglected his own private affairs to care for the souls of the citizens, he deserved a reward rather than a punishment. He audaciously proposed that he be given free meals for life in the Prytaneum, which was an honor reserved for Olympic victors and visiting dignitaries. The jury was stunned by this apparent mockery of their authority and the gravity of the situation. The gasps of the crowd must have been audible as Socrates seemingly courted death with his refusal to submit. At the urging of his wealthy friends like Plato and Crito, he eventually offered to pay a fine of 30 minae, which was a substantial sum guaranteed by his friends. But the damage had been done by his initial proposal of free meals. The jury felt insulted, and their anger turned the tide against him. In the second vote regarding sentencing, more jurors voted for death than had voted for his guilt in the first place. The sentence was death by drinking a cup of hemlock. Socrates received the verdict with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial. He addressed the jurors who had voted to condemn him, warning them that they were not escaping a pest, but bringing down a harsh judgment upon themselves from future generations. He told them that suppressing criticism by killing the critic was not a noble way to live. He then spoke to those who voted for acquittal, offering them comfort by suggesting that death is either a dreamless sleep or a migration of the soul to a place where he could question the great heroes of the past. After the trial, Socrates was taken to the prison, which was a series of caves carved into the rock near the Agora. Usually execution followed immediately after the trial, but a religious festival involving a ship sent to Delos was in progress. By law, no executions could take place until the sacred ship returned to Athens. This granted Socrates a final month of life, which he spent in chains, but in good spirits, conversing with his friends who visited him daily. The prison became a makeshift classroom where the most profound discussions on the immortality of the soul took place. During this month of confinement, the investigation into the nature of justice continued through the actions of his friends. Crito, who was one of his oldest and most loyal companions, arrived at the prison one morning before dawn with a fully formed escape plan. The guards had been bribed, and a safe haven had been arranged in Thessaly. All Socrates had to do was walk out of the cell and into exile. It was the perfect solution that would save his life and spare Athens the guilt of killing its wisest citizen. The breakthrough in understanding the character of Socrates comes in his response to Crito. He refused to escape. He argued that he had lived in Athens for 70 years and accepted the benefits of its laws and protection. To break the law now simply because it was inconvenient or unjust to him personally would be to destroy the authority of the laws themselves. He personified the laws of Athens, arguing that he had entered into a social contract with the city. He chose to die as a loyal citizen rather than live as a lawbreaker. The day of execution finally arrived when the sacred ship returned from Delos. The friends of Socrates gathered in his cell for the final time, including Phaedo, who would later recount the events. Socrates sent away the women of his family to spare them, the agony of watching him die, though his friends were weeping openly. He spent his final hours discussing the separation of the soul from the body, arguing that a true philosopher spends his whole life preparing for death and dying. He bathed himself to save the women the trouble of washing his corpse. As sunset approached, the jailer entered with the cup of poison. The jailer, who had come to respect Socrates, wept as he gave the instructions. Socrates took the cup without a trembling hand or a change in color. He asked if he could pour a libation to the gods, but was told there was only enough poison for the execution. With a prayer for a safe migration to the afterlife, he raised the cup to his lips and drank the hemlock cheerfully and without hesitation. The poison used was likely Conium maculatum, or poison hemlock, which causes a gradual paralysis of the central nervous system. Socrates walked around the cell as instructed until his legs felt heavy, and then he lay down on his back. The numbness spread from his feet upwards. He remained lucid until the end, describing the sensation of the coldness creeping toward his heart. The scene was one of immense sorrow for his friends, but of supreme dignity for the philosopher. His final words were enigmatic and have been the subject of debate for centuries. He uncovered his face and said to Crito that we owe a rooster to Asclepius, so please do not forget to pay the debt. Asclepius was the god of healing. Many interpret this to mean that Socrates viewed death as a cure for the sickness of life, or perhaps he was simply ensuring that a literal religious debt was paid, showing his piety until the very end. After speaking these words, he lay still, and his eyes glazed over. The aftermath of the execution was almost immediate regret within the city of Athens. The people soon realized that they had silenced their conscience, and the backlash against the accusers was severe. Diogenes Laertius reports that the Athenians eventually felt such remorse that they closed the wrestling grounds and gymnasiums in mourning. They turned their anger on the prosecutors, sending Meletus to death and banishing Anytus and Lycon from the city. A bronze statue was later erected in honor of Socrates. The death of Socrates became the founding myth of the discipline of philosophy. His student Plato was so profoundly affected by the trial that he abandoned his political ambitions and dedicated his life to vindicating his teacher. Plato wrote the Apology and other dialogues which immortalized the trial and ensured that the defense of Socrates would be read for thousands of years. The trial transformed Socrates from a local eccentric into a universal symbol of integrity and intellectual freedom. From a true crime perspective, the trial of Socrates remains a cold case of judicial murder. It highlights the dangers of mob rule and the vulnerability of justice when fear and prejudice infiltrate the courtroom. The charges were trumped up and the evidence was non-existent, yet the outcome was lethal. It serves as a stark reminder that democracy without protection for minority opinions can easily descend into tyranny of the majority. The legal system failed because it was designed to enforce conformity rather than discover truth. The legacy of this event is woven into the fabric of Western thought. Every time a whistleblower speaks truth to power, or a dissident refuses to recant their beliefs, they are walking in the footsteps of the barefoot philosopher. The image of the old man calmly drinking the hemlock remains one of the most powerful scenes in history. It challenges us to ask ourselves if there are principles we would be willing to die for, and if we have the courage to question the status quo. Historians and philosophers still debate the real reasons behind the trial. Was it truly about religion, or was it a political purge of anti-democratic elements? Was Socrates seeking martyrdom to prove his philosophical points? The mystery of his true intentions remains because he wrote nothing down himself. We only know him through the lens of his admirers like Plato and Xenophon, or his critics like Aristophanes. The real Socrates remains an elusive figure, hiding behind the mask of his famous irony. The site of his imprisonment and execution can still be visited in Athens today. It is a humble spot near the bustling tourist areas, a quiet reminder of the day the city killed its best citizen. The physical evidence is scant, but the intellectual evidence is overwhelming. The questions he asked on the streets of Athens 24 centuries ago are the same questions we struggle with today regarding virtue and justice, and the good life. The trial did not silence him, it amplified his voice. In the end, the trial of Socrates puts us all on the stand. It forces us to examine our own lives and our own societies. It asks us how we treat those who challenge our deepest beliefs and expose our ignorance. Do we listen and engage in dialogue, or do we reach for the hemlock to silence the dissonance? The case of the state versus Socrates is technically closed, but the verdict on humanity is still out. As we look back at the dusty records of 399 BC, we see a reflection of our own modern struggles with free speech and cancel culture and political polarization. The tragedy of Athens is a timeless warning. The Midnight Docket closes this file not with a solution, but with a question that Socrates himself might have asked. Is it better to suffer injustice than to commit it? The answer you give might define who you are just as it defined him.